Edward III of England.
Edward III was King of England from February 1, 1327 until his death. He is noted for his military success and for restoring royal authority after the disastrous reign of his father, Edward II. Edward III transformed the Kingdom of England into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. His reign also saw vital developments in legislation and government, in particular the evolution of the English Parliament, as well as the ravages of the Black Death. He is one of only 6 British monarchs to have ruled England or its successor kingdoms for more than 50 years. Edward was crowned at age 14 after his father was deposed by his mother and her consort Roger Mortimer. At age 17 he led a successful coup against Mortimer, the de facto ruler of the country, and began his personal reign. After a successful campaign in Scotland he declared himself rightful heir to the French throne in 1337, but his claim was denied due to the Salic Law. This started what would become known as the 100 Years' War. Following some initial setbacks, the war went exceptionally well for England. Victories at Crécy and Poitiers led to the highly favourable Treaty of Bretigny. Edward's later years, however, were marked by international failure and domestic strife, largely as a result of his inactivity and poor health. Edward III was a temperamental man but capable of unusual clemency. He was in many ways a conventional king whose main interest was warfare. Admired in his own time and for centuries after, Edward was denounced as an irresponsible adventurer by later Whig historians such as William Stubbs. This view has been challenged recently and modern historians credit him with some significant achievements.
Early life.
Edward was born at Windsor Castle on November 13, 1312, and was often referred to as Edward of Windsor in his early years. The reign of his father, Edward II, was a particularly problematic period of English history. One source of contention was the king's inactivity, and repeated failure, in the ongoing war with Scotland. Another controversial issue was the king's exclusive patronage of a small group of royal favourites. The birth of a male heir in 1312 temporarily improved Edward II's position in relation to the baronial opposition. To bolster further the independent prestige of the young prince, the king had him created Earl of Chester at only 12 days of age. In 1325, Edward II was faced with a demand from the French king, Charles IV, to perform homage for the English Duchy of Aquitaine. Edward was reluctant to leave the country, as discontent was once again brewing domestically, particularly over his relationship with a favourite Hugh Despenser the Younger. Instead, he had his son Edward created Earl of Aquitaine in his place and sent him to France to perform the homage. The young Edward was accompanied by his mother Isabella, who was the sister of King Charles, and was meant to negotiate a peace treaty with the French. While in France, however, Isabella conspired with the exiled Roger Mortimer to have the king deposed. To build up diplomatic and military support for the venture, Isabella has Prince Edward engaged to the 12-year-old Philippa of Hainault. An invasion of England was launched and Edward II's forces deserted him completely. The king was forced to relinquish the throne to his son, who was crowned as Edward III on February 1, 1327. It was not long before the new reign also met with other problems caused by the central position at court of Roger Mortimer, who was now the de facto ruler of England. Mortimer used his power to acquire noble estates and titles, and his unpopularity grew with a humiliating defeat by the Scots at the Battle of Stanhope Park and the ensuing Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed with the Scots in 1328. Also the young king came into conflict with his guardian. Mortimer knew his position in relation to the king was precarious and subjected Edward to disrespect. The tension increased after Edward and Philippa, who had married on January 24, 1328, had a son on June 15, 1330. Eventually, Edward decided to take direct action against Mortimer. Aided by his close companion William Montagu and a small number of other trusted men, Edward took Mortimer by surprise at Nottingham Castle on October 19, 1330. Mortimer was executed and Edward III's personal reign began.
Early reign.
Edward III was not content with the peace agreement made in his name, but the renewal of the war with Scotland originated in private, rather than royal initiative. A group of English magnates known as the Disinherited, who had lost land in Scotland by the peace accord, staged an invasion of Scotland and won a great victory at the Battle of Duplin Muir in 1332. They attempted to install Edward Balliol as King of Scotland in David II's place, but Balliol was soon expelled and was forced to seek the help of Edward III. The English king responded by laying siege to the important border town of Berwick and defeated a large relieving army at the Battle of Halidon Hill. Edward reinstated Balliol on the throne and received a substantial amount of land in southern Scotland. These victories proved hard to sustain, however, as forces loyal to David II gradually regained control of the country. In 1338, Edward was forced to agree to a truce with the Scots. One reason for the change of strategy towards Scotland was a growing concern for the relationship between England and France. As long as Scotland and France were in an alliance, the English were faced with the prospect of fighting a war on two fronts. The French carried out raids on English coastal towns, leading to rumours in England of a full-scale French invasion. In 1337, Philip VI confiscated the English king's Duchy of Aquitaine and the county of Ponthieu. Instead of seeking a peaceful resolution to the conflict by paying homage to the French king, the way his father had done, Edward responded by laying claim to the French crown as the grandson of Philip IV. The French, however, invoked the Salic law of succession and rejected his claim. Instead, they upheld the rights of Philip IV's nephew, King Philip VI, an Arnatic descendant of the House of France, thereby setting the stage for the Hundred Years' War. See family tree below. In the early stages of the war, Edward's strategy was to build alliances with other continental princes. In 1338, Louis IV named Edward Vicar General of the Holy Roman Empire and promised his support. These measures, however, produced few results. The only major military victory in this phase of the war was the English naval victory at Sluys on June 24, 1340, which secured English control of the Channel. Meanwhile, the fiscal pressure on the kingdom caused by Edward's expensive alliances led to discontent at home. The Regency Council at home was frustrated by the mounting national debt, while the king and his commanders on the continent were angered by the government in England's failure to provide sufficient funds. To deal with the situation, Edward himself returned to England, arriving in London unannounced on November 30, 1340. Finding the affairs of the realm in disorder, he purged the royal administration of a great number of ministers and judges. These measures did not bring domestic stability, however, and a standoff ensued between the king and John de Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury. Stratford claimed that Edward had violated the laws of the land by arresting royal officers. A certain level of conciliation was reached at the Parliament of April 1341. Here Edward was forced to accept severe limitations to his financial and administrative freedom, in return for a grant of taxation. Yet in October the same year, the king repudiated this statute and Archbishop Stratford was politically ostracized. The extraordinary circumstances of the April Parliament had forced the king into submission, but under normal circumstances the powers of the king in medieval England were virtually unlimited, a fact that Edward was able to exploit. Roger called Edward III's own claim to be the sovereign of the seas into question, arguing there was hardly any royal navy before the reign of Henry v. 1413-22. Although Roger may have made this claim, the reality was that King John had already developed a royal fleet of galleys and had attempted to establish an administration for these ships and ones which were arrested, privately owned ships pulled into royal national service. Henry III, his successor, continued this work. Notwithstanding the fact that he, along with his predecessor, had hoped to develop a strong and efficient naval administration, their endeavours produced one that was informal and mostly ad hoc. A formal naval administration emerged during Edward's reign which was composed of lay administrators and headed by William de Cool, Matthew de Torksey, and John de Hatefield successively, with them being titled, Clerk of the King's Ships. Sir Robert de Cruel was the last to fill this position during Edward III's reign and would have the longest tenure in this position. It was during his tenure that Edward's naval administration would become a base for what evolved during the reigns of successors such as Henry VIII of England's Council of Marine and Navy Board and Charles I of England's Board of Admiralty. Roger also argues that for much of the 14th century, the French had the upper hand, apart from Sluys in 1340 and, perhaps, off Winchelsea in 1350. Yet, the French never invaded England and France's King John II died in captivity in England. There was a need for an English navy to play a role in this and to handle other matters, such as the insurrection of the Anglo-Irish lords and acts of piracy.
Fortunes of war.
By the early 1340s, it was clear that Edward's policy of alliances was too costly, and yielded too few results. The following years saw more direct involvement by English armies, including in the Breton War of Succession, but these interventions also proved fruitless at first. A major change came in July 1346, when Edward staged a major offensive, sailing for Normandy with a force of 15,000 men. His army sacked the city of Caen, and marched across northern France, to meet up with English forces in Flanders. It was not Edward's initial intention to engage the French army, but at Crécy, just north of the Somme, he found favourable terrain and decided to fight an army led by Philip VI. On August 26, the English army defeated a far larger French army in the Battle of Crécy. Shortly after this, on October 17, an English army defeated and captured King David II of Scotland at the Battle of Neville's Cross. With his northern borders secured, Edward felt free to continue his major offensive against France, laying siege to the town of Calais. The operation was the greatest English venture of the 100 Years' War, involving an army of 35,000 men. The siege started on September 4, 1346, and lasted until the town surrendered on August 3, 1347. After the fall of Calais, factors outside of Edward's control forced him to wind down the war effort. In 1348, the Black Death struck England with full force, killing a third or more of the country's population. This loss of manpower led to a shortage of farm labour, and a corresponding rise in wages. The great landowners struggled with the shortage of manpower and the resulting inflation in labour cost. To curb the rise in wages, the King and Parliament responded with the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These attempts to regulate wages could not succeed in the long run, but in the short term they were enforced with great vigour. All in all, the plague did not lead to a full-scale breakdown of government and society, and recovery was remarkably swift. This was to a large extent thanks to the competent leadership of royal administrators such as Treasurer William de Choiseul and Chief Justice William Addington. It was not until the mid-1350s that military operations on the continent were resumed on a large scale. In 1356, Edward's oldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, won an important victory in the Battle of Poitiers. The greatly outnumbered English forces not only routed the French, but captured the French king, John II. After a succession of victories, the English held great possessions in France, the French king was in English custody, and the French central government had almost totally collapsed. There has been a historical debate as to whether Edward's claim to the French crown originally was genuine, or if it was simply a political ploy meant to put pressure on the French government. Regardless of the original intent, the stated claim now seemed to be within reach. Yet a campaign in 1359, meant to complete the undertaking, was inconclusive. In 1360, therefore, Edward accepted the Treaty of Bretigny, whereby he renounced his claims to the French throne, but secured his extended French possessions in full sovereignty.
Later reign.
While Edward's early reign had been energetic and successful, his later years were marked by inertia, military failure and political strife. The day-to-day affairs of the state had less appeal to Edward than military campaigning, so during the 1360s Edward increasingly relied on the help of his subordinates, in particular William Wickham. A relative upstart, Wickham was made Keeper of the Privy Seal in 1363 and Chancellor in 1367, though due to political difficulties connected with his inexperience, the Parliament forced him to resign the chancellorship in 1371. Compounding Edward's difficulties were the deaths of his most trusted men, some from the 1361-62 recurrence of the plague. William Montagu, Earl of Salisbury, Edward's companion in the 1330 coup, died as early as 1344. William de Clinton, who had also been with the king at Nottingham, died in 1354. One of the earls created in 1337, William de Bohun, Earl of Northampton, died in 1360, and the next year Henry of Grismont, perhaps the greatest of Edward's captains, succumbed to what was probably plague. Their deaths left the majority of the magnates younger and more naturally aligned to the princes than to the king himself. Increasingly, Edward began to rely on his sons for the leadership of military operations. The king's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, attempted to subdue by force the largely autonomous Anglo-Irish lords in Ireland. The venture failed, and the only lasting mark he left were the suppressive statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. In France, meanwhile, the decade following the Treaty of Bretigny was one of relative tranquility, but on April 8, 1364 John II died in captivity in England, after unsuccessfully trying to raise his own ransom at home. He was followed by the vigorous Charles V, who enlisted the help of the capable Constable Bertrand du Guesclin. In 1369, the French war started anew, and Edward's younger son John of Gaunt was given the responsibility of a military campaign. The effort failed, and with the Treaty of Bruges in 1375, the great English possessions in France were reduced to only the coastal towns of Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne. Military failure abroad, and the associated fiscal pressure of constant campaigns, led to political discontent at home. The problems came to a head in the Parliament of 1376, the so-called Good Parliament. The Parliament was called to grant taxation, but the House of Commons took the opportunity to address specific grievances. In particular, criticism was directed at some of the king's closest advisers. Chamberlain William Latimer and Steward of the Household John Neville were dismissed from their positions. Edward's mistress, Alice Perrers, who was seen to hold far too much power over the aging king, was banished from court. Yet the real adversary of the Commons, supported by powerful men such as Wickham and Edmund de Mortimer, Earl of March, was John of Gaunt. Both the king and the Black Prince were by this time incapacitated by illness, leaving Gaunt in virtual control of government. Gaunt was forced to give in to the demands of Parliament, but at its next convocation, in 1377, most of the achievements of the Good Parliament were reversed. Edward himself, however, did not have much to do with any of this. After around 1375 he played a limited role in the government of the realm. Around September 29, 1376 he fell ill with a large abscess. After a brief period of recovery in February 1377, the king died of a stroke at Chene on June 21. He was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, King Richard II, son of the Black Prince, since the Black Prince himself had died on June 8, 1376.
Achievements of the reign. Legislation.
The middle years of Edward's reign were a period of significant legislative activity. Perhaps the best-known piece of legislation was the Statute of Labourers of 1351, which addressed the labour shortage problem caused by the Black Death. The statute fixed wages at their pre-plague level and checked peasant mobility by asserting that lords had first claim on their men's services. In spite of concerted efforts to uphold the statute, it eventually failed due to competition among landowners for labour. The law has been described as an attempt to legislate against the law of supply and demand, which made it doomed to fail. Nevertheless, the labour shortage had created a community of interest between the smaller landowners of the House of Commons and the greater landowners of the House of Lords. The resulting measures angered the peasants, leading to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The reign of Edward III coincided with the so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy at Avignon. During the wars with France, opposition emerged in England against perceived injustices by a papacy largely controlled by the French crown. Papal taxation of the English Church was suspected to be financing the nation's enemies, while the practice of provisions, the Pope providing benefices for clerics, caused resentment in the English population. The statutes of provisors and praemunera, of 1350 and 1353 respectively, aimed to amend this by banning papal benefices, as well as limiting the power of the papal court over English subjects. The statutes did not, however, sever the ties between the king and the pope, who were equally dependent upon each other. Other legislation of importance includes the Treason Act of 1351. It was precisely the harmony of the reign that allowed a consensus on the definition of this controversial crime. Yet the most significant legal reform was probably that concerning the justices of the peace. This institution began before the reign of Edward III but, by 1350, the justices had been given the power not only to investigate crimes and make arrests, but also to try cases, including those of felony. With this, an enduring fixture in the administration of local English justice had been created.
Parliament and taxation.
Parliament as a representative institution was already well established by the time of Edward III, but the reign was nevertheless central to its development. During this period, membership in the English baronage, formerly a somewhat indistinct group, became restricted to those who received a personal summons to Parliament. This happened as Parliament gradually developed into a bicameral institution, composed of a House of Lords and a House of Commons. Yet it was not in the upper, but in the lower house that the greatest changes took place, with the expanding political role of the Commons. Informative is the Good Parliament, where the Commons for the first time, albeit with noble support, were responsible for precipitating a political crisis. In the process, both the procedure of impeachment and the office of the Speaker were created. Even though the political gains were of only temporary duration, this Parliament represented a watershed in English political history. The political influence of the Commons originally lay in their right to grant taxes. The financial demands of the 100 Years' War were enormous, and the king and his ministers tried different methods of covering the expenses. The king had a steady income from crown lands, and could also take up substantial loans from Italian and domestic financiers. To finance warfare on Edward III's scale, however, the king had to resort to taxation of his subjects. Taxation took two primary forms, levy and customs. The levy was a grant of a proportion of all movable property, normally a tenth for towns and a 15th for farmland. This could produce large sums of money, but each such levy had to be approved by Parliament, and the king had to prove the necessity. The customs therefore provided a welcome supplement, as a steady and reliable source of income. An ancient duty on the export of wool had existed since 1275. Edward I had tried to introduce an additional duty on wool, but this unpopular mulcult, or unjust exaction, was soon abandoned. Then, from 1336 onwards, a series of schemes aimed at increasing royal revenues from wool export were introduced. After some initial problems and discontent, it was agreed through the Ordinance of the Staple of 1353 that the new customs should be approved by Parliament, though in reality they became permanent. Through the steady taxation of Edward III's reign, Parliament, and in particular the Commons, gained political influence. A consensus emerged that in order for a tax to be just, the king had to prove its necessity, it had to be granted by the community of the realm, and it had to be to the benefit of that community. In addition to imposing taxes, Parliament would also present petitions for redress of grievances to the king, most often concerning misgovernment by royal officials. This way the system was beneficial for both parties. Through this process the Commons, and the community they represented, became increasingly politically aware, and the foundation was laid for the particular English brand of constitutional monarchy.
Chivalry and national identity.
Central to Edward III's policy was reliance on the higher nobility for purposes of war and administration. While his father had regularly been in conflict with a great portion of his peerage, Edward III successfully created a spirit of camaraderie between himself and his greatest subjects. Both Edward I and Edward II had been limited in their policy towards the nobility, allowing the creation of few new peerages during the 60 years preceding Edward III's reign. The young king reversed this trend when, in 1337, as a preparation for the imminent war, he created 6 new earls on the same day. At the same time, Edward expanded the ranks of the peerage upwards, by introducing the new title of Duke for close relatives of the king. Furthermore, Edward bolstered the sense of community within this group by the creation of the Order of the Garter, probably in 1348. A plan from 1344 to revive the Round Table of King Arthur never came to fruition, but the new order carried connotations from this legend by the circular shape of the garter. Polydore Virgil tells of how the young Joan of Kent, Countess of Salisbury, allegedly the king's favourite at the time, accidentally dropped her garter at a ball at Calais. King Edward responded to the ensuing ridicule of the crowd by tying the garter around his own knee with the words "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks ill of it. This reinforcement of the aristocracy must be seen in conjunction with the war in France, as must the emerging sense of national identity. Just as the war with Scotland had done, the fear of a French invasion helped strengthen a sense of national unity, and nationalised the aristocracy that had been largely Anglo-French since the Norman conquest. Since the time of Edward I, popular myth suggested that the French planned to extinguish the English language, and as his grandfather had done, Edward III made the most of this scare. As a result, the English language experienced a strong revival. In 1362, a statute of pleading ordered the English language to be used in law courts, and the year after, Parliament was for the first time opened in English. At the same time, the vernacular saw a revival as a literary language, through the works of William Langland, John Gower and especially the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. Yet the extent of this anglicisation must not be exaggerated. The Statute of 1362 was in fact written in the French language and had little immediate effect, and Parliament was opened in that language as late as 1377. The Order of the Garter, though a distinctly English institution, included also foreign members such as John V, Duke of Brittany and Sir Robert of Namur. Edward III, himself bilingual, viewed himself as legitimate king of both England and France, and could not show preferential treatment for one part of his domains over another.
Assessment and character.
Edward III enjoyed unprecedented popularity in his own lifetime, and even the troubles of his later reign were never blamed directly on the king himself. Edward's contemporary Jean Froissart wrote in his chronicles that his like had not been seen since the days of King Arthur. This view persisted for a while but, with time, the image of the king changed. The Whig historians of a later age preferred constitutional reform to foreign conquest and discredited Edward for ignoring his responsibilities to his own nation. In the words of Bishop Stubbs, influential as Stubbs was, it was long before this view was challenged. In a 1960 article, titled Edward III and the Historians, May Macusack pointed out the teleological nature of Stubbs' judgment. A medieval king could not be expected to work towards the future ideal of a parliamentary monarchy. Rather his role was a pragmatic one, to maintain order and solve problems as they arose. At this, Edward III excelled. Edward had also been accused of endowing his younger sons too liberally and thereby promoting dynastic strife culminating in the Wars of the Roses. This claim was rejected by K. B. Macfarlane, who argued that this was not only the common policy of the age, but also the best. Later biographers of the king such as Mark Ormerod and Ian Mortimer have followed this historiographical trend. However, the older negative view has not completely disappeared. As recently as 2001, Norman Cantor described Edward III as an avaricious and sadistic thug, and a destructive and merciless force. From what is known of Edward's character, he could be impulsive and temperamental, as was seen by his actions against Stratford and the ministers in 1340-41. At the same time, he was well known for his clemency. Mortimer's grandson was not only absolved, but came to play an important part in the French wars, and was eventually made a Knight of the Garter. Both in his religious views and his interests, Edward was a conventional man. His favourite pursuit was the art of war and, in this, he conformed to the medieval notion of good kingship. As a warrior he was so successful that one modern military historian has described him as the greatest general in English history. He seems to have been unusually devoted to his wife, Queen Philippa. Much has been made of Edward's sexual licentiousness, but there is no evidence of any infidelity on the king's part before Alice Perez became his lover, and by that time the queen was already terminally ill. This devotion extended to the rest of the family as well. In contrast to so many of his predecessors, Edward never experienced opposition from any of his 5 adult sons.
Family tree.
Edward's claim on the French throne was based on his descent from King Philip IV of France, through his mother Isabella. The following, simplified family tree shows the dynastic background for the 100 Years' War.
Fictional portrayals.
Edward III was portrayed by Michael Hordern in the film The Dark Avenger. In Mel Gibson's 1995 film Braveheart, William Wallace is implied to be the real father of Edward III, despite Wallace's death many years before Edward's birth. In World Without End, Edward III is portrayed by Blake Ritson.
Footnotes.
Edward first styled himself King of France in 1337, though he did not officially assume the title until 1340. Prestwich, 2005, pages 307-8, Mortimer, 2006, pages 1, Emrod, 2012, Mortimer, 2006, pages 21, for an account of the political conflicts of Edward II's early years, see, Madicott, J.R., 1970. Thomas of Lancaster, 1307-1322. Oxford, Oxford University Press. ISBN 0-19-821837-0. OCLC 132766, Tuck, 1985, pages 52, Prestwich, 1980, pages 80, Prestwich, 2005, pages 189, Mortimer, 2006, pages 23, Tuck, 1985, pages 88, for an account of Edward II's later years, see, Fried, N.M., 1979. The Tyranny and Fall of Edward II, 1321-1326. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. ISBN 0-521-54806-3, Mortimer, 2006, pages 39, Prestwich, 2005, pages 213, Prestwich, 2005, pages 216, Mortimer, 2006, pages 46, Mortimer, 2006, pages 54. The later fate of Edward II has been a source of much scholarly debate. For a summary of the evidence, see, Mortimer, 2006, pages 405-10, Makisak, 1959, pages 98-100, Mortimer, 2006, pages 67, 81, Prestwich, 2005, pages 223-4, Prestwich, 2005, pages 244, De Vries, 1996, pages 114-5, Prestwich, 2205, pages 244-5, A. B. Ormrod, 1990, pages 21, McLagan, Michael. Lauder, Geary, 1981. Line of Succession, Heraldry of the Royal Families of Europe. London, MacDonald and Company, pages 17. ISBN 0-85613-276-4, Makisak, 1959, pages 117-9. Edward did not officially assume the title King of England and France until 1340. Ormrod, 1990, pages 21-2, Sumption, 1999, pages 106, Rogers, 2000, pages 155, Makisak, 1959, pages 128-9, Prestwich, 2005, pages 273-5, Makisak, 1959, pages 168, Fried, 1975, pages 149-61, Prestwich, 2005, pages 275-6, Makisak, 1959, pages 174-5, Ormrod, 1990, pages 29, Susan Rose. The Navy of the Lancastrian Kings. London, George Allen and Unwin, 1982. Pages 7 ISBN 0-04-942175-1, James Sherborne. War, Politics and Culture in 14th-Century England. London, The Hambledon Press, 1994. Pages 32 ISBN 1-85285-086-8, N. A. M. Roger, The Safeguard of the Sea, 1997, p. 99. Makisak. Pages 509 and other pages, Mortimer, 2006, pages 205. The main exception was Henry of Lancaster's victory in the Battle of Alberich in 1345. Fowler, 1969, pages 58-9, Makisak, 1959, pages 132, Prestwich, 2005, pages 316-8, De Vries, 1996, pages 155-76, War, 1991, pages 17, Ormrod, 1990, pages 31, Sumption, 1999, pages 537-581. For more on the debate over mortality rates, see Hatcher, John, 1977. Plague, Population and the English Economy, 1348-1530. London, Macmillan pages 11-20. ISBN 0-333-21293-2, War, 1991, pages 109, Prestwich, 2005, pages 547-8, Prestwich, 2005, pages 553, Ormrod, 1986, pages 175-88, Prestwich, 2005, pages 550, Makisak, 1959, pages 139, Makisak, 1959, pages 139-40. For a summary of the debate, see Prestwich, 2005, pages 307-10, Prestwich, 2005, pages 326, Ormrod, 1990, pages 39-40. For more on Wickham, see Davis, Virginia, 2007. William Wickham. Hambledon Continuum. ISBN 978-1-84725-172-5. Ormrod, 1990, pages 90-4. Fowler, 1969, pages 217-8. Ormrod, 1990, pages 127-8. Makisak, 1959, pages 231. Tuck, 1985, pages 138. Ormrod, 1990, pages 27. Makisak, 1959, pages 145. Holmes, 1975, pages 66. Ormrod, 1990, pages 35-7. Makisak, 1959, pages 387-94. Harris, 2006, pages 440. The earlier belief that Gaunt packed the 1377 Parliament with his own supporters is no longer widely held. C. Wedgwood, Josiah C. 1930. John of Gaunt and the Packing of Parliament. The English Historical Review XLV, CLXXX, 623-625 doi, 10.1093/XLV CLXXX. 623. ISSN 0013-8266, A. B. Ormrod, 1990, pages 52. Makisak, 1959, pages 392, 397. Makisak, 1959, pages 335. Hanault, Barbara A. February 9, 1989. The Ties That Bound, Peasant Families in Medieval England. Oxford University Press US. Pages 139. ISBN 978-0-19-504564-2. Prestwich, M.C., 1983. Parliament and the Community of the Realm in the 14th Century. In Cosgrove, Art. Maguire, J.I., eds. Parliament and Community, Papers read before the Irish Conference of Historians, Dublin 27 to 30 May 1981. Apple Tree Press. Pages 20. ISBN 978-0-904651-93-5. Makisak, 1959, pages 272. Makisak, 1959, pages 280-1. Ormrod, 1990, pages 140-3. Makisak, 1959, pages 257. The pioneering study of this process is, Putnam, B.H., 1929. The Transformation of the Keepers of the Peace into the Justices of the Peace 1327-1380. Transactions of the Royal Historical Society 12, pages 19-48 doi, 10.2307/3,678,675. ISSN 0080-4401, Musson and Amrod, 1999, pages 50-4. Harris, 2006, pages 66. Makisak, 1959, pages 186-7. Harris, 2006, pages 67. Prestwich, 1980, pages 288. Fritz, Ronald H. Robeson, William Baxter, 2002. Historical Dictionary of Late Medieval England, 1272-1485. Greenwood Publishing Group. Pages 409. ISBN 978-0-313-29124-1. Retrieved May 8, 2011. Ormrod, 1990, pages 60-1. Brown, 1989, pages 80-4. Brown, 1989, pages 70-1. Harris, 1975, pages 57, 69. Brown, 1989, pages 67-9, 226-8. Harris, 1975, pages 509. Prestwich, 2005, pages 282-3. Harris, 1975, pages 509-17. A. B. Ormrod, 1990, pages 114-5. Given Wilson, 1996, pages 29-31. Given Wilson, 1996, pages 35-6. Prestwich, 2005, pages 364. Tuck, 1985, pages 133. Makisak, 1959, pages 251-2. Prestwich, 1980, pages 209-10. For the original text, see Statute of Pleading, 1362, languageandlaw.org. Loyola Law School. Retrieved May 8, 2011. Makisak, 1959, pages 524. Makisak, 1959, pages 526-32. Prestwich, 2005, pages 556. Makisak, 1959, pages 253. Prestwich, 2005, pages 554. Ormrod, 1990, pages 51. Stubbs, William, 1880. The Constitutional History of England E. Oxford, Clarendon. Pages 3. Makisak, 1960, pages 4-5. Macfarlane, K.B., 1981. England in the 15th Century, Collected Essays. Continuum International Publishing Group. Pages 238. ISBN 978-0-907628-01-9. Retrieved May 8, 2011. Cantor, Norman, 2002. In the Wake of the Plague, The Black Death and the World It Made. HarperCollins pages 37, 39. ISBN 0-06-001434-2. Prestwich, 2005, pages 289. Makisak, 1959, pages 255. Ormrod, 1990, pages 56. Prestwich, 2005, pages 290-1. Rogers, C.J., 2002. England's Greatest General. MHQ, The Quarterly Journal of Military History 14, 4, 34-45. Mortimer, 2006, pages 400-1, Prestwich, 1980, pages 241, Prestwich, 2005, pages 290, The Perfect King, The Life of Edward III, Father of the English Nation, Ian Mortimer, Vintage Books London, 2006, Prince William of Hatfield, 1337-1337, Find a Grave Memorial. Findargrave.com. Retrieved January 26, 2014, A. B. Corley, Charles. Medieval Lands Project, Kings of England, 1066-1603. Foundation for Medieval Genealogy. Retrieved January 4, 2012, Ewan, pp 1219-21, http://www.imdb.com/ Title/ TT18788805/ ?ref_s are unmarked by international failure and domestic strife, largely as a result of his inactivity and poor health. Edward III was a temperamental man but capable of unusual clemency. He was in many ways a conventional king whose main interest was warfare. Admired in his own time and for centuries after, Edward was denounced as an irresponsible adventurer by later Whig historians such as William Stubbs. This view has been challenged recently and modern historians credit him with some significant achievements.
Early life.
Edward was born at Windsor Castle on November 13, 1312, and was often referred to as Edward of Windsor in his early years. The reign of his father, Edward II, was a particularly problematic period of English history. One source of contention was the king's inactivity, and repeated failure, in the ongoing war with Scotland. Another controversial issue was the king's exclusive patronage of a small group of royal favourites. The birth of a male heir in 1312 temporarily improved Edward II's position in relation to the baronial opposition. To bolster further the independent prestige of the young prince, the king had him created Earl of Chester at only 12 days of age. In 1325, Edward II.
Edward III of England.
Edward III was King of England from February 1, 1327 until his death. He is noted for his military success and for restoring royal authority after the disastrous reign of his father, Edward II. Edward III transformed the Kingdom of England into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. His reign also saw vital developments in legislation and government, in particular the evolution of the English Parliament, as well as the ravages of the Black Death. He is one of only 6 British monarchs to have ruled England or its successor kingdoms for more than 50 years. Edward was crowned at age 14 after his father was deposed by his mother and her consort Roger Mortimer. At age 17 he led a successful coup against Mortimer, the de facto ruler of the country, and began his personal reign. After a successful campaign in Scotland he declared himself rightful heir to the French throne in 1337 but his claim was denied due to the Salic Law. This started what would become known as the 100 Years' War. Following some initial setbacks the war went exceptionally well for England. Victories at Crécy and Poitiers led to the highly favourable Treaty of Bretigny. Edward's later years, however, were in Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed with the Scots in 1328. Also the young king came into conflict with his guardian. Mortimer knew his position in relation to the king was precarious and subjected Edward to disrespect. The tension increased after Edward and Philippa, who had married on January 24, 1328, had a son on June 15, 1330. Eventually, Edward decided to take direct action against Mortimer. Aided by his close companion William Montagu and a small number of other trusted men, Edward took Mortimer by surprise at Nottingham Castle on October 19, 1330. Mortimer was executed and Edward III's personal reign began.
Early reign.
Edward III was not content with the peace agreement made in his name, but the renewal of the war with Scotland originated in private, rather than royal initiative. A group of English magnates known as the Disinherited, who had lost land in Scotland by the peace accord, staged an invasion of Scotland and won a great victory at the Battle of Duplin Muir in 1332. They attempted to install Edward Balliol as King of Scotland in David II's place, but Balliol was soon expelled and was forced to seek the help of Edward III. The English king responded by laying siege to the important border town of Berwick and defeated a large relieving army at the Battle of Halidon Hill. Edward reinstated Balliol on the throne and received a substantial amount of land in southern Scotland. These victories proved hard to sustain, however, as forces loyal to David II gradually regained control of the country. In 1338, Edward was forced to agree to a truce with the Scots. One reason for the change of strategy towards Scotland was a growing concern for the relationship between England and France. As long as Scotland and France were in an alliance, the English were faced with the prospect of fighting a war on two fronts. The French carried out raids on English coastal towns, leading to rumours in England of a full-scale French invasion. In 1337, Philip VI confiscated the English king's Duchy of Aquitaine and the county of Ponthieu. Instead of seeking a peaceful resolution to the conflict by paying homage to the French king, the way his father had done, Edward responded by laying claim to the French crown as the grandson of Philip IV. The French, however, invoked the Salic law of succession and rejected his claim. Instead, they upheld the rights of Philip IV's nephew, King Philip VI, an Arnatic descendant of the House of France, thereby setting the stage. Was faced with the demand from the French king, Charles IV, to perform homage for the English Duchy of Aquitaine. Edward was reluctant to leave the country, as discontent was once again brewing domestically, particularly over his relationship with a favourite Hugh Despenser the Younger. Instead, he had his son Edward created Earl of Aquitaine in his place and sent him to France to perform the homage. The young Edward was accompanied by his mother Isabella, who was the sister of King Charles, and was meant to negotiate a peace treaty with the French. While in France, however, Isabella conspired with the exiled Roger Mortimer to have the king deposed. To build up diplomatic and military support for the venture, Isabella has Prince Edward engaged to the 12-year-old Philippa of Hainault. An invasion of England was launched and Edward II's forces deserted him completely. The king was forced to relinquish the throne to his son, who was crowned as Edward III on February 1, 1327. It was not long before the new reign also met with other problems caused by the central position at court of Roger Mortimer, who was now the de facto ruler of England. Mortimer used his power to acquire noble estates and titles, and his unpopularity grew with a humiliating defeat by the Scots at the Battle of Stanhope Park and the ensuing